In the autumn of 1562, Elizabeth I lay dying of smallpox here at Hampton Court. She was 29 years old and had no heir to replace her. Panic spread throughout the court. Her council called an urgent meeting to try to decide the succession. But after several days, against all the odds, Elizabeth recovered. However, this question of the succession would never go away, and for the next 40 years, Elizabeth would be plagued with pressure either to marry or to name her heir. Fast forward to March 1603. Elizabeth, now 69 years old, lay dying at Richmond Palace. According to the accepted narrative, almost with her last breath, she named her heir as James VI of Scotland, declaring, "I will have none but him." And so she died, and the throne passed peacefully to the Stuarts. Or so we've been led to believe. A lot of what we know about Elizabeth I's death and the succession of James I comes from William Camden's Annals. Now, that was the earliest biography of Elizabeth, and he describes how on her deathbed she named James as her heir. But dramatic new evidence that came to light 2 years ago proves that his work was one of fiction, that it was rewritten years later to make it look more predetermined than it had actually been. In fact, this new research shows that Elizabeth died without naming anybody her heir. But James had written himself into the story and into the line of succession. But James wasn't an obvious choice for Elizabeth's heir. He was a Scot, and England and Scotland had been bitter enemies for centuries. In fact, Henry VIII had barred the Scots from ever inheriting the English throne, so James, technically speaking, was illegal as a successor. He was also the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's bitterest rival. So, if it hadn't been James, who might it have been? Was there someone else with an even stronger claim to Elizabeth's throne? Well, my new book sets out to answer that very question. We're actually very lucky that when Elizabeth I died, civil war didn't break out. That was certainly the fear of her councillors, who would have spent many hours sitting right here in the council chamber at Hampton Court, worrying about all those who were vying for Elizabeth's throne. Well, in 1600, a man called Thomas Wilson, a member of government, wrote, "This crown is not likely to fall to the ground for want of heads that claim to wear it." Now, he did admit that it was straitly prohibited to discuss the succession, but said there were at least 12 people who, in his words, gaped for Elizabeth's death. So exactly who were the contenders? Well, in front of me here are some of the strongest claimants to Elizabeth's throne. Let's start with one of the main rivals for Elizabeth's throne. Mary Stuart, better known as Mary, Queen of Scots. Well, she certainly had the strongest blood claim to the English throne. She was a descendant of Henry VIII's eldest sister, Margaret, and her claim was strengthened by the fact that she was briefly Queen of France. But working against her was the fact that Henry VIII had barred his Scottish relatives from ever inheriting the English throne. And there was also a statute of 1351 which barred so-called aliens, those not born on English soil, from ever becoming king or queen. Well, neither of those things stopped Mary from campaigning tirelessly for Elizabeth's throne, and ultimately her ambition would be her downfall. Elizabeth ordered her execution in 1587. So I'm going to give Mary a rating of 60%. On Mary's death, her claim passed directly to her son, James VI of Scotland. In his favour, he was an experienced ruler. He'd been King of Scots for decades, and he had cultivated some very useful relationships on Elizabeth's government. He was also friendly with the Queen herself. They'd maintained a very long-standing correspondence, and Elizabeth seemed to be trying to advise James on how to be a good future king. But it wasn't all plain sailing for him, because he was tainted by association with his treacherous mother, and he faced the same bars to his claim to the English throne as she did in terms of Henry VIII's will. And clearly, he himself felt so insecure about his right to Elizabeth's throne that he later had Camden rewrite history in his favour. Still, with some powerful English allies and the implicit favour of Elizabeth herself, he still had very solid odds. I'm going to give him 70%. So who did James feel threatened by? For many, the obvious choice for Elizabeth's throne was Lady Catherine Grey. Well, she was a descendant of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary, and he had actually stipulated that Mary's descendants would have a strong claim to his throne. In fact, they would be next in line after his own children if they died without heirs. And to make Catherine's claim stronger still, Henry VIII's son and successor, Edward VI, had actually altered the succession in favour of the Greys, Lady Jane Grey being the elder sister of Catherine. Well, Catherine sought to make her claim even stronger by making a secret marriage to somebody else who had a claim to Elizabeth's throne. Edward Seymour, the nephew of the late Queen Jane Seymour and a cousin of the Queen. They were the ultimate power couple, but they married without Elizabeth's permission, and she was furious when she found out. She declared the marriage illegitimate, and therefore the sons that marriage produced were also illegitimate. But I think it's telling that Catherine Grey was painted here with her eldest son, Edward, because at Elizabeth's death, legally speaking, it's Edward who should have been next in line. Despite Elizabeth's disapproval, Catherine and her sons remained viable contenders for the throne for years afterwards. So I'm going to give Catherine a good rating. Like James, Arbella Stuart was descended from Henry VIII's elder sister Margaret. Actually, she had the edge over James because she had been born on English soil. Well, Arbella also had in her favour two quite formidable grandmothers. One of them a claimant herself, Lady Margaret Douglas, Henry VIII's niece, and another, the famous Elizabethan matriarch, Bess of Hardwicke. These two grandmothers conspired to make Arbella a serious contender for Elizabeth's throne. She was raised in a quite suffocating environment away from court to be a future queen, but denied any freedom of action. And she grew up with a quite unstable temperament. But her position was strengthened when Lady Catherine Grey's marriage was declared illegitimate, and therefore also Catherine's sons. Ultimately, Arbella was her own worst enemy, because she grew up with this unstable temperament and was very haughty and arrogant. She quickly got on the wrong side of Elizabeth, who deemed her unfit to rule. She later made a secret marriage to William Seymour, a descendant of Catherine Grey, but paid the ultimate price because she spent the rest of her life in the Tower. Elizabeth might not have thought Arbella the stuff of which great queens are made, but her claim was still valid, so I'm going to rate her 55%. Unlike the other claimants, Henry Hastings, 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, didn't have Tudor blood. He was related to the Plantagenets. He was the great-grandson of Lady Margaret Pole, and his grandfather, Henry Lord Montagu, had been a close personal favourite of Henry VIII. And also, of course, he was male, which counted for quite a lot at this time, so he had strong support. But Henry himself never had any ambitions for the crown. He remained loyal to Elizabeth. Despite that, she never quite trusted him, and it wasn't until later in life that she promoted him to office. Well, Henry, in fact, would die childless, and his lack of ambition for the throne means that I'm going to rank him a bit lower at 40%. Lady Margaret Stanley certainly had a strong claim to Elizabeth's throne. So she was descended from Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary too, just like the Grey sisters. But her mother was Eleanor Brandon, who was the younger daughter of Princess Mary, whereas the Greys were descended from the elder daughter. So they, in theory, were superior to Margaret. But she claimed that the treason of Lady Jane Grey made them invalid as claimants to the throne. Margaret also had two sons. You can see one of them, Ferdinando, right here. But she was a Catholic, which made her unacceptable to many of the Protestants at Elizabeth's court. And the fact that her claim was inferior to that of the Grey sisters means that I'm going to give her the lower rating of 30%. The last person with any significant claim to Elizabeth's throne was the Infanta Isabella of Spain, who you can see here on the left. She was the daughter of Philip II and Elizabeth of Valois. Well, when Philip's attempts to seize the English throne by force failed, he started to promote the claim of his daughter Isabella. Well, in a twist, you could argue that Isabella's claim was actually stronger than the Tudors. Through her mother, she was a descendant of John of Gaunt, a son of King Edward III, whereas the Tudors were descended from an illegitimate line. But even though Isabella had the might of Spain at her back, it was unlikely that the people of England would ever accept a Spanish princess as their next queen. So I'm going to give her the lowest rating of 25%. In the end, James VI did inherit Elizabeth's throne, thus uniting the two kingdoms. But it had been far from inevitable. This idea of a smooth transition from the Tudors to the Stuarts was all thanks to a carefully constructed narrative. In fact, James had secured the throne and his legitimacy through political alliances and by rewriting the historical record. Had just a few things shifted, a different marriage, a different ally, then the whole course of British history might have completely changed. As it turned out, the end of the Tudors was bad news for Parliament and for England. James, as King of England, disregarded all the advice that Elizabeth had tried to give him about how to rule effectively here. He quickly got on the wrong side of Parliament. He refused to play the king, as Elizabeth had urged him to, and lived mostly in private with just a few favourites. And his dogged pursuit of radical Protestantism alienated swathes of England's Catholics and sparked rebellion and conspiracies. To make matters worse, James passed on his style of monarchy to his son and successor, Charles I. Well, Charles took the idea of the divine right of kings to even greater extremes, which ultimately made an enemy of Parliament and the people, plunging the country into a bitter civil war and resulting in the execution of the king. So within the space of just a generation, the entire monarchy had been destroyed.